But when I look at my options for defeating wokeism, 100 times out of 100, I will side with Christians. And religious Christians, in virtually every battle in America that I'm aware of, are allies of religious traditional Jew.
Good evening. This is Joel Rosenberg with the Rosenberg Report. Welcome. We are not, of course, in Jerusalem this week. We're coming to you from Denver, Colorado, where I was recently just attending and speaking as one of the keynote speakers at a religious liberty summit that was held in Park City, Utah. Now, last week, of course, I interviewed Kelly Shackelford, who was one of the leading experts on the Supreme Court and the legal reform battle that's been going on in the United States for many years. He runs First Liberty, and he's one of the leading evangelical experts on the Constitution and the Supreme Court and the litigation that's going on over the future of the country. But I interviewed somebody else at that conference, a guy named Josh Hammer. Josh is a senior editor at Newsweek. He has a podcast. He himself is a constitutional lawyer and an expert on sort of the legal and cultural and dynamic crosswinds, cross currents that are going on in the United States. And when I saw his presentation at this Religious Liberty Summit in Park City, Utah, I thought, Josh, I really want to sit down and interview you because you've got a unique perspective on the threat to the United States. You're going to hear in a moment what he thinks is the greatest threat. But I want to set this up by saying that Josh has been a sort of a Twitter friend of mine for a while. We had not spent much time in person until this event in Utah. But what is intriguing to me about Josh at several levels, he's a very clear and lucid thinker. He really has a unique insight into what's going on in the United States, but he's not an evangelical. He's Jewish. Not Jewish like me that believes in Jesus. He's Jewish, observant, religiously Jewish, doesn't believe in Jesus. But one of the things you're going to hear him say, you're going to hear him say a lot of things today that you might not expect, that makes him sound like an evangelical. He's not. I want to be upfront about that. But we actually see many areas of life, many areas of what's going on in Israel and here in the United States similarly. And I think his is an important voice. And I want to, sort of walk you through some of the things he told me over the course of this program that I think were not only so interesting to me and to my wife and to others at the summit, but I think will be interesting to you as well. Let's begin my conversation with Josh Hammer, senior editor at Newsweek. Josh Hammer, thank you so much for sitting down with me. I want to start with, what do you think is the biggest threat to America generally, but American religious freedom and religious liberty in particular, since this is the summit you and I are speaking at? Yeah,
Joel, great to be with you. So, I mean, as far as I can tell, and just looking at the country broader and cultural trends, political trends, I have been beating the drum for a few years now that the metastasis of the woke ideology, which is basically leftist illiberalism, that is essentially how I would define it, the spread of that throughout all the institutions, throughout all of the private, public institutions in America, that is really the number one threat. I mean, if you look from the administrative state to the judiciary, to the corporate boardroom, to the K through 12 classroom, I mean, this thing rears its head like an ugly, ugly cancer. And unless we defeat it, unless we actually rise to the challenge of offering a substantive countervision, and then actually using power and frankly just quashing it and making it dead as a doorknob, I mean, that has the potential to engulf us. I think back to Abraham Lincoln, who famously said that, and Abraham Lincoln, he knew this better than anyone. He famously said that, America would not be defeated from abroad. If America was to ultimately perish, it would come from within. And, Lincoln in his time, he rose to the challenge and he defeated the greatest threat to America from within. And sometimes I wonder whether we can do the same. And, I use that analogy, actually, it's a somewhat, admittedly, kind of charged analogy, kind of comparing our current civil strife to the mid-19th century. But I think it actually makes sense. If you think about what is actually going on now, Joel, I mean, people in America, we can't agree on how many genders there are. I think back to the antebellum period of the 1850s going up to the Civil War itself in the 1860s, and chattel slavery being the original sin of the American Republic, being just a horrific, horrific, abominable stain. But, people at that time still worshiped the same God. They still understood how many genders there were. So viewed from that particular perspective, I wonder whether we're actually even further apart than we were back then. I hate to sound so dire, but that really is kind of the threat as I see it.
So give me some specific examples that to you just scream, this is the worst of wokeism. A word, by the way, that even 5 years ago, except for in people watching very, very closely, it feels like for most Americans, the concept of wokeness has come upon them like a storm. What are some of the examples that just scream at you, this is exactly why it's so dangerous?
I mean, just the current state of the gender ideology and, what I sometimes somewhat cheekily refer to as the rainbow jihad. I mean, if you look at what is currently going on with the transgender movement, and frankly also in the schools, I mean, they have brought this literally to the schools. Look, I live in Florida. I mean, I have seen this firsthand. I've seen, what our government in Florida has done to try to combat this. There is literally pornographic material in the schools. I mean, in the elementary school classrooms. I mean, I work in Newsweek, Joel. I publish a number of op-eds kind of painting a picture here in fairly explicit terms. I'm literally quoting some of these books that these schools are exposing the children to, talking about, not just sexual orientation, but actual explicit sexual acts, and just horrible.
At what ages?
We're talking here about elementary school. I mean, we're literally talking here about second, third, fourth graders. I mean, saying that there's nothing wrong with, I'm not gonna spell it out, but like very, very graphic stuff. And what they're fundamentally doing here, is something that the left has been trying to do for a very, very long time, which is to establish that the custodians of the future of the country is not the parents, it's not the nuclear family, it is the state. And specifically, it is the ruling ideology of the state. And the left has been trying to do this literally going back as far as Marx and Bolshevik social theory. I think back actually to the concept of no-fault divorce, which really didn't spread in America until the 1960s or so. But the history of no-fault divorce is very interesting, actually. It was literally proposed by a Bolshevik social theorist around the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917, 1918. And the goal then was the same goal as the goal now, which is to erode the foundations of the family and make sure that the government, not kind of the troglodytes, those traditional kind of backwater reactionaries in the family, but the government is one who's actually shepherding the future of the children and therefore the society.
I think I agree with Josh. I mean, there's a lot of threats here in the United States, but he is right that this concept of wokeism, he considers it the #1 threat. And as you heard him say, it's the #1 threat because he says that that woke ideology is a zero-sum game with biblical Christianity or Judeo-Christian values, right? You can't have a situation in which God didn't create us, didn't make us male and female, that you can change your gender, that marriage, it doesn't really matter if it's between one man and one woman. It could be between 2 men, 2 women, or multiple people, which was an interesting conversation to have in Utah. But my point is, Josh's point is that this whole concept of wokeism and that America is inherently a racist country, not a flawed country trying to make things better and in fact making things better in certain areas, though clearly some things are getting much worse. But he's saying that this concept of wokeism is incompatible, 100% incompatible with biblical Judeo-Christian thinking in which God did make us, that God did create us male and female and has certain roles, and you can't just pick and choose. That is not a normal American battle. It's not a normal American discussion. Like, hey, top marginal tax rates, oh, they should be 49%. No, they should be 25%. No, let's have a flat tax at 17%. That is sort of a normal political debate. Oh, we spend, I don't know, $2 trillion on the budget. Let's only spend 1.8 and save some money and make, some tax cuts. Or no, let's spend 3 trillion instead. Let's borrow more. Those are normal political debates. They're not really, you can say they're based on morality. How much should the government take or not take? How much should it spend or not spend? But that's not a fundamental, entirely different worldview approach that wokeism versus biblical Judeo-Christianity, that's a fundamental debate. And how can you compromise on that? How can you see common ground in that, right? And that's the battle that's raging. Josh is absolutely right on that. So what does Josh Hammer, Jewish, observantly Jewish, religiously Jewish, not an evangelical, not a Jew who believes in Jesus like I do, what does he think is the answer? If he could only choose one thing, one reform, what does he think it should be to take America into a more healthy direction in the 21st century? Listen to what he says.
So when you look at wokeism in the year 2023, it has all of the basic characteristics and tenets of a religion. There are sacraments, there is eternal damnation, there are heretics, there is apostasy. I mean, it's all kind of the
apocalyptic warnings of what could happen if you don't listen.
Right, and climate change is obviously a very good example of that in particular, right? Greenhouse gas emissions. It has all those basic characteristics. And it makes a lot of sense when you consider the fact that the people who are typically espousing the tenets of the woke ideology and wokeism are oftentimes less religious, less traditional people, oftentimes outright agnostics, if not full atheists. And they have that spiritual void to fill. And that's where kind of wokeism comes in. And they feel like that they are kind of just doing their job. They are finding meaning by, advocating for whether it's Black Lives Matter in the streets of the summer of 2020 after George Floyd, whether it's transgender, quote unquote, rights, whatever. I mean, things like that. They think they are achieving kind of the same kind of
high moral ends.
Right. They probably view those fights similar to what a different era might have viewed kind of the march in Selma, Alabama, which is pretty frightening, to be honest with you, to kind of think about that. But that's probably how they view it. So when you realize that we're not talking here about kind of the minutia of abstruse public policy. We're not talking about kind of capital gains tax rates. We're talking fundamentally about differing theological and anthropological conceptions of the relationship between man, justice, and the state. Then you have to kind of start thinking about, if this actually is the threat, if wokeism really is a threat that I and many others say it is, then what can rise to that challenge to actually counter that threat? And unfortunately, what I see a lot of folks on our side doing is operating from a mentality of kind of live and let live. They're preaching just tolerance, just give us our breadcrumbs, give us like a dispensation from the woke regime here. But fundamentally, that's not going to work. That's not going to work because wokeism operates as a one-way ratchet where it ultimately attempts to subsume and conquer all of us within our respective confines of.
Because it's a moral crusade, right?
It's a moral crusade.
And you're making the case that it's actually essentially a theological crusade disguised as being anti-religion.
Right. It's a theological crusade to remake America. It kind of harkens me back actually to when Barack Obama famously said before he was elected, we are 5 days away from fundamentally transforming the United States. I mean, that was kind of a predecessor to modern wokeism, really, that statement right there. So what will it take to operate at that level? Well, the obvious answer is authentic religion, which in America obviously means Christianity. And look, I mean, I am Jewish. I'm a traditional Jew. I wrap tefillin every day. I keep kosher. We do Shabbat every Friday night. I mean, I am a very proud religious, and I at least fairly observant Jew in many ways here. But when I look at my options for defeating wokeism, 100 times out of 100, I will side with Christians. And religious Christians, in virtually every battle in America that I'm aware of, are allies of religious traditional Jews. I mean, there's a reason why Orthodox Jews in America, I think, broke 83-17 for Trump in the 2020 election. That's a higher percentage than even kind of Mormons, evangelical Christians.
It's actually slightly higher than evangelicals.
Right, it's a shockingly high percentage, right? Yeah. I mean, we have the exact same fears. We are both terrified of being conquered by wokeism. So if I'm thinking strategically here, about what could defeat wokeism, I will absolutely try to ally myself with Christianity, to say nothing that Christianity is the religion of America. I mean, it's true, obviously, that we have the Establishment Clause, which says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. It's also true that Justice Joseph Story, in his commentaries in 1833, referred to America repeatedly as a Christian nation. So literally 40 years after the Bill of Rights was adopted here. So for both historical reasons and present prudential reasons of actually trying to push back the tide of wokeism, and just trying to think strategically about what can rise to that level of an alternative, substantive, theological, and anthropological view to quash wokeism, I think ecumenical Christianity has to be the answer, in America at least. And the other kind of reason as to why what I'm saying is not popular, which kind of gets to the reason as to why kind of political conservatism, unfortunately, is not popular for many Jews in America, is that most Jews in America are not particularly religious. That's just the tragedy of it. I've been fighting this fight, Joel, since I was in high school. There are a few issues under the sun that rile me up quite like this one. But if you look at kind of the percentage of American Jews who do basic kind of Jewish rituals, like pray every day, daven every day, do something for kosher, do Shabbat. I mean, the frequency with which Jews in America attend shul, shockingly low. And Reform Judaism in particular, which is really nothing if not kind of a direct offshoot of Democratic Party social justice activism, that is a plurality, if not outright majority of American Jews, unfortunately, would call themselves Reformed Jews. But again, if you kind of call that aside and you look at like the actual religious or traditional Jews in America, again, Orthodox Jews broke for Trump 83-17. Haredi Jews, like ultra-Orthodox Jews, even higher. It was like 94-6 or something like insanely high like that. So they're on board. And, in fact, I've spoken with many other...
Meaning they feel like Trump and a team of evangelicals around him are more likely to advance their interests than a much higher percentage of Jews in the Democratic Party and, helping Biden or whomever.
Totally. Look, progressives are my domestic enemies. I don't know how else to say it. And, that comes in any different number of shades or a number of progressive Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, whatever.
So there you heard it. Josh Hammer, observant Jew, senior editor at Newsweek, constitutional lawyer. He's making the case that the only way, or the best way, but he's saying the only way to get America moving in the right direction is to have a revival of robust biblical Christianity. Now, that is not something you're normally going to hear from an observant religious Jewish person who doesn't believe in Christianity. But he doesn't see Christianity as hostile to Jews. He doesn't see Christianity as, obviously he disagrees, right? He doesn't see Jesus the way I see Jesus, as the Messiah and our Savior. Okay, that's a big issue, but in the context of the direction of America, he's making the passionate case as a religious observant Jew that we need more robust Christianity because we're losing our spiritual moorings. And he believes that the country, and including Jews, are safer and healthier in a country where Christianity is robust, not where it's imposed, not where people are forced by the government or anyone else to believe in something. We're not talking about that. He's not talking about that. I also want to mention that one of the things I love about America and what I love about coming back is the history of religious freedom, which benefited my family. It was my father, his Orthodox Jewish parents, grandparents, great-grandparents that escaped out of Russia in 1906, 1907 in a couple different movements of the family. Why? Because they were being persecuted in Russia. They were being not just harassed. Orthodox Jews were being beaten, raped, murdered. And so my family escaped. And where did they go? They went to the United States. They came here where they found religious freedom, political freedom, to believe what they want, to live as they wanted, and in my father's case, had the freedom to explore the New Testament and come to faith in Jesus Christ if he wanted to. Thank God he wanted to, and it changed his life. That relationship with Jesus, the Jewish Messiah, changed his life. It changed my mom's life. It changed my life, and I hope it's changing yours. Josh Hammer and I disagree on who Jesus is, but he and I agree that America is in deep, deep trouble because there are philosophical and political forces that are just clashing in these titanic battles, and it's a zero-sum game. It's difficult to imagine how both sides are going to coexist if one side believes there's a God and one side doesn't. One side believes that men and women were created by God in God's image, and that you can't change your gender. It's not random. It's God's plan and design for us. That was considered normal thinking for 5,000 years. Now you're sort of a racist and a homophobe and a transphobe if you think that. So this is the clash, and Josh is a very lucid thinker on these issues. And as you heard in the previous segment, he believes that a revival of biblical Christianity is critical to the health and the rescue of the United States, or we're headed over the fall.